Over the last 5 years, Dungeon Quest has become one of the biggest games in all of Roblox, and in order to understand how we got here, we must go all the way back to the earliest version of the game. Welcome to Dungeon Quest 2019. And yeah, things definitely look different. And looking in our dungeons, yeah, we only had one, being Desert Temple, which I'll play and show you what it looked like all the way back then. So we're here in Desert Temple, and yeah, this was the very first dungeon to ever be released in Dungeon Quest. Yeah, dungeon games on Roblox were really not something that were popular. And the thing about this game is it would provide like a unique sense of teamwork to where you'd have to strategize with other players to actually be able to beat the dungeon. And this would actually cause it to become the most popular game on Roblox and would inspire so many other games to come. But yeah, this version of Dungeon Quest is kind of boring. So let's look at the very first update we've ever seen in this game, which would be this right here. Pirate Island would actually be the very first update Dungeon Quest had ever received. And man, this update was a huge one, because this dungeon would be one of the hardest dungeons of all time, and would not be beaten for over 12 hours after its release. And keep in mind, this is when Dungeon Quest was the most popular game on Roblox. But yeah, compared to Desert Temple, yeah, this is a huge upgrade. Now let's skip ahead to the next big update, which would actually be this shop icon right here. Yup, this would actually be one of the biggest updates Dungeon Quest had ever seen, because it would introduce cosmetics into the game. And unfortunately, I don't have any OG cosmetics, but this isn't even the huge thing about this update. The huge update would actually be the addition of wave defense. This update would be quite literally the biggest update they've ever seen. And yeah, players absolutely loved it, because players were starting to get kind of bored of doing the same dungeon over and over again. So yeah, they made it like into an endless wave mode, which gave players a new sense of challenge. And as I mentioned before, challenge was something players loved, because it allowed them to strategize. Yeah, let's look at the next big Dungeon Quest update, which would actually be the Christmas event, which would be Dungeon Quest's biggest event ever. Now, the Christmas event was cool, but that wasn't actually the important part, because in this time, Dungeon Quest would receive one of the biggest awards possible, the Bloxy Award. If you guys have seen the Bloxy Awards, you would know how important this actually is. And to summarize it, the Bloxy Awards are pretty much like awards that Roblox does every year, pretty much giving the best games and the best developers different rewards and different things. And the future of Dungeon Quest was truly looking bright. Now, year 2 wasn't quite as good of a year. In fact, it would be the downfall of Dungeon Quest. And that would all be for one reason: boss raids. And yeah, let me just show you what I mean. Boss raids would be the single update that would kill Dungeon Quest. Now, why is this? Well, boss raids would be released after Steampunk Sewers, which would be considered one of the worst dungeons in the game. And yeah, it was released at already a poor time. Now, to summarize what boss raids actually is, it's pretty much like a little challenge that the game provides, where you have to kill a boss in a certain amount of time. So it pretty much just cuts out the entire dungeon besides the boss, which for obvious reasons, players didn't like. But what made boss raids even worse was that you only had a 30% chance of dropping loot. So pretty much beating the dungeon would not even give you loot, which made this game very annoying to play. And this would be what would cause Dungeon Quest to reach its all-time low. And yeah, it really seemed as if boss raids was gonna kill off this game. Well, that is until we got a single update which would help alleviate the damages boss raids caused, which would be this dungeon right here. Volcanic Chambers would be the dungeon to release after boss raids. Well, I guess after Orbital Outpost. But yeah, this dungeon would be considered the best dungeon in the game, because yeah, it actually looks breathtaking. But something else Volcanic Chambers would introduce would be these legendary spells, which would be one of the biggest updates Dungeon Quest had ever seen, because for the longest time, players did not really have like a certain spell to use, but legendary spells would change that, because they would be extremely rare, but you would be able to keep them for every single dungeon to come. But on release, these spells right here were worth so much gear. Yeah, you had to trade like pretty much the best set in the game 50 times over to get one. But players were looking for something new, and that new thing would be Arena Champions, which if we go over to their game page, Yeah, it's kind of private right now. In some, Arena Champions was pretty much PvP for Dungeon Quest, where you'd fight other players using spells from the game. And yeah, the game would actually become pretty popular. Now that was year 2, but let's skip over to year 3. Year 3 definitely was not a big year for Dungeon Quest, but the one thing we did see was the release of Northern Lands. Now specifically, Northern Lands wasn't really a huge update, but Northern Lands would also be the release of a brand new Dungeon Quest edition, which would be bonus bosses. But the thing about this bonus boss was it would allow you to unlock ultimates, which was the newest rarity of weapon. Now if you thought legendary spells were rare, ultimates were about 3 times rarer, and pretty much no one dropped them. Yeah, some people grinded for hundreds of hours and didn't even get a single one. It was truly brutal. But other than that, this year was pretty uneventful. But yeah, let's move on to year 4. Which year 4 was unfortunately the year where V-Cafe left Dungeon Quest. Yeah, I know, it was a very sad time. But in replacement, we got a new development team by the name of Voldex, who would purchase Dungeon Quest for, yeah, an unspecified amount. But they would release what would be considered the best dungeon to ever come in Dungeon Quest, which would be this right here, the Yokai Peaks. And yeah, this dungeon was absolutely massive, having 4 different bosses to fight in a single dungeon. Not to mention, this had a bunch of different Easter eggs you could obtain. Now this dungeon would actually be when a lot of new players started coming to Dungeon Quest, and Voldex kind of noticed this, and that was when they started to release reworks of previous dungeons. Because an issue Dungeon Quest had was that the old dungeons that I mentioned before, like Winter Outpost and Desert Temple, were kind of outdated and honestly needed a rework. And yeah, Voldex delivered. And that was pretty much all for year 4, so we have to look at year 5, which is current time. With Voldex doing good things, there would also come a lot of new problems, which would be pay to win, and how pay to win would really hurt this game. Because as I mentioned before, pay to win was a system that didn't really exist. But with the new development team, they started using Dungeon Quest as a way to make more money, and that's where players started to really have an issue. But yeah, that's beyond the point. Let's go look at year 5. In this year, we've already gotten a bunch of new updates, including dungeon reworks, different events, and yeah, it has been a huge year so far. And if you guys have looked at the player count for Dungeon Quest, it has completely skyrocketed, being close to as popular as it once was. And yeah, this year isn't even close to over. And we recently got like a leak of every single update that would be happening in the future, and honestly it's promising, and this year could quite literally turn out to be one of the best years in the game's history. And yeah, throughout Dungeon Quest 5-year history, so much has happened and it's gone through so many different events. And yeah, this was a very brief summary of all 5 years of Dungeon Quest, but if you guys want to watch a good video, then click the video on the screen, and yeah, I'll see you there.